Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's seminar, which is being offered as a part of the CTS Fall Transportation Seminar Series. My name is Linda Prisen with the Center for Transportation Studies here at the university. And just a little background information, CTS and the ITS Institute will offer one transportation-related seminar each week in the fall on Thursday afternoons in this room from 3:30 to 4:30, with the exception of a couple of holidays. And they're open and free to anyone who's interested in transportation, including practitioners and students and university folks. The seminar today is being held in conjunction with the meeting of the CTS Transportation and the Economy Council. So we just finished that meeting. We've got a good group from that council who has stayed for the seminar today. And a schedule of upcoming seminars can be found on the CTS website. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Today's seminar is being streamed live on the CTS website, and so we do have a remote audience as well as this audience in the room. We'll ask you to hold your questions here in the room until the end of the seminar, and you'll notice that this microphone doesn't project in the room, but it is projecting to our web audience. So when it's time for the question and answer session, we'll ask you to use this microphone so that those who are listening online can hear you. And if you're listening online, we also have a mechanism for you to type in questions during that session. So we'll have the Q&A at the end. And I think that's all I have. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce the council chair for the CTS Transportation and the Economy Council, Ken Buckeye from MnDOT, and he will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Linda. It is my pleasure to introduce Lee Munich. Lee and I have worked together for quite a few years now on various transportation research topics. Lee is a senior fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and he directs the state and local policy program. He has a wide range of interests, but he primarily focuses on transportation policy, finance, congestion pricing, rural road safety, regional economic development, and industry clusters. He's held a wide range of positions at the state and local government, and he's currently director for the National Center for Excellence in Rural Safety, and he co-chairs the Transportation Research Board Congestion Pricing Committee. The ability to better manage demand and to send drivers stronger price signals through congestion pricing is one of the motivators for considering mileage-based fees, which is Lee's topic today. The presentation will focus on findings from his work and his team that he did for the ITS Institute, looking at the motor fuel tax, tax principles, technology, and transitional issues dealing with distance-based fees. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lee.
Well, thank you, Ken. I think I gave sort of the first part of this presentation to this group before, but it was a while back, so maybe some of you have forgotten it, and for those who weren't, we'll cover it again. But this is a project that's been ongoing for the last couple of years. My colleagues, David Coyle, a research assistant who did the bulk of the work and the writing and pulling all the pieces together. It was sort of a team effort. Farrell Robinson, who was a major contributor to this whole effort. Jerry Zhao, who helped in framing some of the finance principles that we used and in helping us work through this, and then my other colleague, Adil Lari. So it was kind of a team project to think about this. And we've been, as Ken mentioned, I've been involved in congestion pricing, MnPass, and related issues for several years, and kind of focusing a lot on, how do you get those sorts of things to happen, and what can we learn from the projects that do go forward. But in the last few years, mileage-based user fees, which has become sort of the preferred term right now, VMT fees was being used for a while, and there may be other names that people give this, not all favorable as time goes on. But we decided, and had support from the ITS Institute, to look into some of the issues related to mileage-based user fees. And the real question was, what's wrong with the fuel tax that we would want to even replace it with a mileage-based user fee? So that was what a lot of this was about, and we were I'm not going to talk about the MBUF policy task force, which really has been working this last year and is in the process of putting together a draft report where a number of leaders around the state, elected officials and others have been kind of looking in depth at these issues. We sort of presented this whole thing to them and said, what do you think about it? Should Minnesota move forward with initial steps towards this, and if so, what things should be under consideration? So that's kind of in process, and I don't want to jinx anything by saying what they might say, because they could say anything in the next couple of months. And there's also been some market research that's gone on where we got better ideas of what the public thinks about it. But this doesn't cover that. This sort of covers our sort of broader look at this and what we could learn from the literature, what we could learn from research that's been done over the years that's going on right now. There's also been an annual mileage-based user fee symposium that we've been involved with hosting with TTI. This is the third year in Breckenridge. We're now planning for a fourth year, just to kind of bring together those people who are interested in this issue and looking at doing the research and seeing whether there's any progress towards the issue. So this was again funded through the ITS Institute, through the Tech Plan program that we manage at the Humphrey School. These were my partners. The whole idea was to examine the fuel tax versus a mileage-based user fee from the perspective of some tax financing principles. So that was kind of the overall focus. And the idea was that this could be the basis for any future outreach and education with the public, with leaders, just to be able to better explain, why there are problems with the fuel tax, why you might want to replace it with a mileage-based user fee, and how this might occur over time. So the report itself, which is available through the CTS website, includes a sort of an assessment of the fuel tax, an assessment of the mileage-based user fee according to these tax principles, assessments of the MBUF technologies and how do different technologies how might they affect the way in which the principles apply, and then some thoughts about what might be a way in which mileage-based user fees would be implemented. So there were two national commissions that were established by U.S. Congress that ended up advocating replacing the current system of funding transportation on the fuel tax with a new distance-based system of user fees. Now, they also said that you've got to, that's a longer-term function. You've got to raise the gas tax or the fuel tax, and in the interim, if you're going to pay for a lot of these things in the system. But they basically concluded that a user-based system is important as far as funding our transportation system, and the gas tax was becoming less of a user-based tool, and we ought to seriously consider moving towards more of a mileage-based system. The state of Oregon conducted a pilot project a few years ago where they demonstrated that you could a way of collecting mileage-based fees by paying at the gas pump, and they've actually been working since that time towards initial steps towards implementing a mileage-based fee for electric vehicles, and the legislature has authorized them to do the planning for that. Has not said it's going to happen yet, but over the next couple of years, they're going to be planning for how they might implement a mileage-based fee for electric vehicles. University of Iowa conducted several pilot tests around the country to determine how drivers respond to mileage-based fee approach using GPS technologies, and they gave them a pot of money and then let them use the technology. And what they did find was that while people were very uncomfortable when they were first presented with this idea of the mileage-based fee, that after using the technology, that they were more there was a more positive attitude towards it. Then there's a growing understanding among transportation leaders that a fuel tax is becoming a less viable way of funding the transportation system, but there is virtually no public understanding of why this is so. So, this is not going to be an easy process if it does occur. Public view of the fuel tax is that the taxes they pay at the pump pay for the transportation system, and that whatever funding problems exist with the system are due to waste and inefficiency. And so what we were trying to do was to sort of see if we could better understand what the issues were and what the evidence shows in terms of a fuel tax on the basis of tax policy principles. And those were efficiency, equity, revenue adequacy, and sustainability, environmental sustainability, and feasibility. So we kind of took sort of what are typical tax principles and we modified them a little bit for what we were trying to do with transportation funding, but these are principles that would apply to any tax system. So, first issue of efficiency. One problem is the fuel taxes do not price for the total cost of the system. There's an inability to price for congestion, which can lead to excessive delays. Hence we talk about congestion pricing, and in this again, this affects both users and businesses. Fuel taxes as pricing mechanisms may also contribute to an unbalanced ratio of auto and truck use versus transit and rail use. It can leave the highways congested while use of public transit and freight rail remain generally below capacity. Fuel taxes lead to an inefficient system investments as they provide poor price signals to public officials and investors. So investments in projects that are overused rather than in most worthwhile projects. And fuel taxes fail to accurately price the use of the system has contributed to urban sprawl. Now, in the report, we could probably have a lot of arguments about this. We sort of look at a number of studies and evidence to try to see to what extent we can use these assertions, but these are sort of some principal efficiency issues that were identified. Equity, we sort of divided equity up into two parts. The first was on user pays and benefits as a sort of measure of equity. You could have treated that as a separate principle, but we decided to include that within equity. Improvements in the motor vehicle fleet, fuel efficiency have allowed drivers to pay less in fuel taxes per vehicle mile traveled, and this trend will continue. So if you drive 10,000 miles a year with a 15 mile per gallon vehicle, you're paying about $300 a year in gas taxes. If you drive a 30 mile per hour vehicle or per mile vehicle, you end up paying about $150. If you drive an electric vehicle, you pay $0. So there's, the users of the system aren't paying for the benefits. Now there may be good, a lot of other benefits from having people driving electric vehicles or more fuel efficient vehicles, but should they be getting a free ride in the system? So that's kind of at one point when all vehicles were equally fuel inefficient, it was closer to a user pay and benefit system than it is now and is becoming. Hybrids and alternative vehicles create even greater disconnect between system costs and user benefits. Not all users pay fuel taxes, as some are exempt while others evade payment. Fuel taxes payments do not cover total internal costs associated with road construction and maintenance, for example, heavy trucks. And fuel tax payments do not recover external costs of congestion and pollution. Fuel tax revenues have been used for non-highway purposes such as mass transit. Now, some might say that's a good thing, but it does violate this principle of user pays. Here's what has been happening. If you can see the gallons per vehicle has been trending downwards through 2007. This is a couple years old, and vehicle registrations and motor vehicle consumption have been trending upwards. But as you can see, there's a gap in vehicle miles traveled is growing faster than the gallons per vehicle because of the fact, obviously, because there's more fuel efficient vehicles. And this gap will continue whether VMT continues to rise in the future, and this again 2007, so there are arguments about whether it'll rise or decline or what direction VMT will go. But whatever direction it goes, vehicles are going to become more fuel efficient, so gas consumption will be lower than VMT. You're going to have and the fixed price per gallon will end up generating lower revenue than you would with a VMT fee. So the second equity principle then is on ability to pay, and actually there are different ways in which people who analyze the tax systems would look at this. One is horizontal equity, which is that people should pay who are sort of in relatively equal positions or equal incomes ought to be paying the same thing. And again, the user pay principle, depending on who owns what type of car they happen to be driving, there's going to be a lot of inequity on a horizontal equity basis. Fuel taxes have a jurisdictional equity problem in which there's a disconnect between what a state pays in fuel tax and what it receives in federal funding. That's sort of a separate issue here. And then thirdly, although fuel taxes help to promote mobility for disadvantaged groups through public transit funding, there remains vertical equity issues that affect lower income groups. And again, this shows what the just about any study that looks at income relative to how much people travel or use of vehicles shows that proportionately lower income users end up paying a lot, paying a lot more out of the system. Anyway, for the gas tax by income group, you can see that it's much higher by taxes. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up the benefits, that they get more benefits. The higher income get more benefits, but this shows the gas taxes by income group and shows that the lowest income groups pays the highest share, and it goes down to the lowest groups. Now you can see, so this is that's just a chart there. Okay. Then another principle then is revenue adequacy and sustainability. As currently structured, fuel taxes fare poorly on revenue adequacy and sustainability grounds. Inflation has eroded purchasing power of the revenue collected through fuel taxes, and again, this is an assertion here that the fuel tax rate is too low and funding is inadequate. Yes, I'm sorry. What am I doing? Oh, all right, good. blocking my microphone here. So our conclusion from looking at this, fuel taxes are unsustainable going forward as a revenue source. Inflation, changes in the price of fuel and fuel efficiency, and the introduction of alternative fuels sort of conspire to reduce the tax base and the amount of fuel tax revenue collected. And here you can see this was, again, this is from one of the reports I mentioned, the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study, which showed the way in which projected U.S. highway and transit account balances are declining. I don't know what the numbers look like today, but we know that, from the discussions going on in Washington, that there's a significant gap in the amount of revenue that's available to continue funding the system. And in Minnesota, we raised the gas tax a couple of years ago, and that was an incremental increase. So we've sort of forestalled some of the immediate issues with regard to funding transportation. We've also received federal money through the recovery grant funds, and so deficit spending has helped to fund some of these things. So a lot of the things have sort of been, in the short term, it may not appear that there's a big problem, but over time, these at both the federal and state level, you can see that there are issues that are going to be faced with regard to funding. Environmental sustainability, fuel taxes weakly adhere to a polluter pays principle. It's a blunt tool in promoting environmental sustainability. Fuel taxes are better equipped to reduce vehicle miles traveled than general sales or income taxes. So, we're saying that the fuel taxes are better than using some other non-user-based mechanism. But current fuel taxes are not commensurate with cost imposed and do not price for congestion, only indirectly related to road use and thus limited ability to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Fuel taxes' ability to reduce petroleum-based fuel consumption and greenhouse gas is limited, mainly due to low tax rates, and then which isn't the case in European countries and most other countries. And the fuel taxes provide some incentive for use of less polluting fuels. However, because of low tax rates in the U.S., the effect is probably marginal. Finally, the principle of feasibility. This is where the fuel taxes do relatively well, even though politically people don't want to raise the fuel tax. It's a relatively invisible tax that most people don't see. That's both good and bad. They may think they're paying more than they actually are with the fuel taxes. So when you talk about raising them, then they become, upset. They think, even though they rarely do fuel taxes sort of increases even coincide with changes in the price of gas. So there may be some perceptions there, but some have said that if people don't see what their taxes are, that it may be somewhat more feasible. It's been very difficult, however, to raise the fuel tax. It's a simple system. There's no issues of privacy or system security. Visibility, visible to a degree, but there are currently low levels of political and public support for raising the gas tax. If fuel taxes more closely adhered to the benefit principle as they did in early to middle decades, they would probably garner greater support. Fuel taxes benefit from some low levels of tax exportation. And then administrative costs, this is probably the biggest benefit of the fuel tax, is that it's very cheap to collect. It's not even collected at the pump, it's collected at the wholesale point, so there are only a limited number of payers, and so the enforcement and compliance costs are relatively low, in the range of 1% to 2%. So this is kind of the scorecard for the fuel tax assessment. On efficiency grounds, we score it as weak. On equity grounds, we sort of give them a moderate scoring here. On revenue and adequacy grounds, it's generally moderate, but on sustainability over time, we do reference it as we do sort of score it as weak. Environmental sustainability, moderate, and then on feasibility, it's fairly strong because of low compliance costs and implementation and operation. Although, on the public and political support, simply because, it's very difficult to raise the tax, it scores a moderate there. So then we did the same thing with the mileage-based user fee and said, how does that score on these different principles? On efficiency, mileage-based user fees can be set to price for total system costs, thus leading to a more efficient travel and less highway congestion. Again, we're talking about something that might be, and it could be in a lot of different ways. So kind of we're scoring this potential system, which might be an ideal system or not, but what it could do relative to the fuel tax. The price signals generated from MBUFs allow users to weigh the true costs of automobile versus transit use and lead to more efficient mode selection. So the idea that people would have, more information about, how much they're traveling, or better information about it, that they might, and how much they're paying for it, there might be more transparency to that. MBUF send price signals to public officials and investors that can lead to more efficient transportation investment. And the effect on land use is less well understood. However, depending on the structure of an MBUF system, MBUFs may help in reducing urban sprawl in some areas. And some of the work that's been done where people do get better mileage-based insurance, where they do see their mileage reported, they see their behavior and they tend to respond to that, and it does give a signal that is stronger than what they get from driving right now, even though they could read the odometer. That's not quite the same as having this kind of a signal. On equity, user pays and benefits. Principal drivers with fuel-efficient and alternative fuel vehicles would not be able to escape MBUF, since unlike fuel taxes, the fee is not based on fuel consumed, but on the actual travel. Shouldn't say there might be other ways that they could escape it, but not based on because they're not consuming fuel. Exemptions and evasion may still cause some equity issues, and it is possible that evasion would increase under an MBUF system. By setting stacked or variable rates, MBUFs have the potential to move towards full cost recovery by both internal and external users. And if, like fuel taxes, revenues are used for non-highway purposes, this will represent a move away from the user pays and benefits principle. Again, it depends on the choices in terms of how the money is spent. Equity on an ability to pay basis, several issues touched on the user pays and benefits principle are likely to either improve horizontal equity or have no effect when compared to the current system of fuel taxes. So the fact that depending, whatever type of vehicle you're driving, that you're going to be paying this fee would help in improving horizontal equity in that regard. Some analysts note the possibility of revenues being allocated to the appropriate jurisdictions. However, it is possible that jurisdictional equity issues will persist with MBUF. So the idea that an individual jurisdiction might have more flexibility in setting and collecting MBUF revenues, which would be easier to allocate under that kind of a system than the gas tax revenues. It would, however, call for, would depend again on how the system is designed. Depending on the structure of the MBUF system, rural and urban drivers are likely to be affected differently. Actually, it's quite possible, and we didn't do an analysis of this, but one of the things, because rural drivers tend to drive less fuel-efficient vehicles, they may be paying more under the fuel tax proportionately than people in urban areas that are driving more fuel-efficient vehicles. So there may be some equity issues there. I mean, the typical thought is that rural areas would be paying more because people have to drive longer distances. We didn't go into this in depth, but there's certainly the issue of rural versus urban comes up as an issue. Like fuel taxes, mileage-based fees are likely to be regressive, and the degree of regressivity will be determined by several currently unknown factors such as the rate structure and how revenues are spent. Revenue adequacy and sustainability. An MBUF system would broaden the tax base since drivers of fuel-efficient and alternative fuel vehicles would no longer pay at a reduced rate or nothing at all. Nonetheless, rates would likely have to be increased to make up for the current funding gaps. There's one of the debates that's been going on with this is if you're going to implement this, the public should you do it just to replace the fuel tax, or what some people would call revenue neutral, although what revenue neutral means, but the idea that if you're going to promote this idea that you should just talk about it in terms of replacing the fuel tax, or do you want to talk about it that it's going to be a source of raising a lot more revenue. Some people say, well, if you're going to do it, if you're going to go through this, you want to raise more revenue. Others say, you really, if you're going to demonstrate to the public that this is something they ought to do, you should just talk about the fact that this is replacing the fuel tax. So that debate still is going on, and in fact, one of the things that I think the task force will be grappling with. While inflation may hamper MBUF's ability to generate sufficient revenue, the revenue sustainability of MBUFs will be largely unaffected by other external factors such as the price of fuel, vehicle fuel efficiencies, and the introduction of alternative fuel vehicles. Environmental sustainability. While a flat mileage-based fee would most likely underperform the current system of fuel taxes in reducing petroleum-based fuel consumption and greenhouse emissions, MBUFs could be structured in such a way to create incentives for the use of fuel-efficient and low-emission vehicles. We've actually sort of gotten, since we did this report, there have been some research that showed that there would be more support for mileage-based fees if there were some sort of green incentive built into it. Although when we did our kind of focus groups in rural Minnesota, they sort of saw that as sort of social engineering, and so it could go either way on that issue. And some are saying you shouldn't add extra bells and whistles to this if you're going to do it, but that might be something that could be added to it. MBUFs could also promote the adoption of less polluting fuels if they are structured so that high polluting vehicles are charged higher rates. That's in effect what Germany has done with their toll collect system for trucks. Is they've set a schedule that basically charges much higher rates on higher polluting vehicles. Feasibility. While the current system of funding transportation using fuel tax is not very popular, there's little indication that MBUFs would be any more popular. It's hard to determine the visibility of an MBUF system and how that would affect public opinion and public support, or how visibility would impact public support because different system designs would yield different levels of visibility. So, you know, if you're trying to create a system where people don't know what they're paying or they don't see it on a regular basis, you know, that might be, it would probably be a more visible system. Tax exportation is not a significant issue when analyzing national MBUF. However, state systems may be able to benefit from tax exportation depending on how their system is designed. Again, this is another issue, is should individual states be allowed to move forward in doing these kinds of systems. Right now, the greatest interest is at the state level, and the federal level is currently not interested, with the exception of a few senators. The U.S. Senate has some interest in it, but the Obama administration has sort of said we're not going to deal with this at this point, and the House hasn't really picked up this issue at this point. So additional feasibility issues. While privacy and the system security remain significant obstacles to successful implementation of a national MBUF system, it is likely that this concern could be mitigated through demonstration of available technologies as well as expanded outreach and education. And there is some thought that, you know, again, it would have to be carefully designed and to protect privacy. There are a number of ways of doing this. Although the more there are the fact that you could be collecting a lot of data about where people are, you know, and that at some point that might be, you know, at least used by the courts or that sort of thing. There's no absolute guarantee of privacy that seems to be able to come out of it. However, there are different levels of it. And as people are using more technologies where in effect they're sharing some of their privacy, it may very well be that this becomes less of an issue, you know, providing that this does not become a vehicle for sort of abusing privacy. In terms of, but nonetheless, that's the first issue that people raise when you talk about this. In terms of administrative feasibility, MBUFs are likely to produce higher implementation, operation, and enforcement costs than the current system of fuel taxes. This is one of the big challenges about how, you know, whether or not you can implement this, is because, you know, it's at no point would you be able to have a system that would be able to be as cheap to collect as the current system of fuel taxes. You know, it could be cheaper than toll systems, or even, you know, current systems that use electronic, such as a MinPass system. There might be ways in which it could come under that, but you're still going to have costs, and you know, depending on the design of the system, probably at least 5% and maybe 15% is sort of the range that people say. And you certainly could have a much more costly system than that. But assuming that you get to scale at some point, costs will come down, but not to the level that the fuel tax is. So the compliance costs may be the same or somewhat higher under an MBUF system than is currently under the current system of fuel taxes, but may be significantly higher for users who are without a bank account or easy access to the internet. So, you know, virtually all the systems are going to call for some sort of credit card collection, which will probably cover most users, but you are going to have this issue of people that don't use those cards or don't have easy access to some of the tools. So how do you deal with that? So this is our scorecard for the MBUF. On efficiency, we give it a strong. On equity, we give it a strong. Now, again, these are all dependent upon how you implement it. So you can have a very strong system. On the other hand, you may not, you know, it's possible you could design a system that wouldn't get all the benefits that we say could happen. Revenue adequacy and sustainability. And revenue adequacy, we give it a moderate, but we do say relatively strong, particularly in comparison with the fuel tax. Environmental sustainability, put it in the moderate range. could be some benefits over the fuel tax, but nothing significant. But then on the feasibility, we give it a week in terms of public and political support, implementation, operation, and enforcement costs. These things may be addressed over time, but at the current point, this is kind of how we read it. So we also looked at technology options and how these relate to the principles. Now, it's a little tricky because these technologies could do a lot of different things, but some of the technologies have more of might have more of an effect on issues like privacy than others. So the simplest technology, and the RAND Corporation, Paul Sorensen did a really very comprehensive study on all of these technologies and what are the issues related to them. And so we basically used, his categorization here, odometer checks being sort of the simplest approach, not particularly, there's not a lot of other benefits to it from the viewpoint of efficiency, but it might very well be a solution or one of the ways in which this is collected for people that either don't want the technology or don't have the capacity to use the technology, or it could be used as sort of a backup mechanism, a variety of ways that you could use odometer checks in conjunction with technologies. Fuel consumption-based estimates based on the vehicle characteristics. That's actually what they did in the Portland pilot. Onboard diagnostics units, onboard with cellular, dedicated short-range partial road network. This is sort of another approach, not sort of where you could use, just included in there even yet. And then GPS, either coarse resolution or fine resolution GPS. So we looked at what are sort of scored these technologies, and this is again a little tricky, but just to kind of illustrate here with a few of them that you get moderate benefits from the OBD2s alone, where you're not really able to get some of the efficiency benefits in terms of the congestion pricing or area pricing part of the system. Whereas with fine resolution GPS, you can get very strong, or with OBD2 with cellular, which Max Donath developed an approach for how that, wrote a paper on that you could use OBD2 with cellular, where you could do some area-based pricing to get some of the benefits that you would out of congestion pricing, and also tying it more to a local jurisdiction. On the other hand, when you get to feasibility, the simpler the technology, the more likely these options are going to be accepted. The more you move to the fine resolution GPS, the more people are going to, the more difficult it's going to be in terms of feasibility. Cost is one of the factors, key factors there, as well as whether or not the public is willing to accept that. So on the other hand, there's a lot of thinking that's been going on, and it makes it, that if people have devices in their vehicles that are being used for other purposes, that if you could combine mileage-based fees with mileage-based insurance and a number of other possibilities that people might want in their vehicle, that might both help in distributing the cost of installing the equipment, but also make people somewhat more comfortable with doing it. So when I was at the ITS World Congress, TransScore was there, and they were promoting a little device that plugs into the OBD2 port, and this is just it's not a real one, but it's what it looks like. And basically what this allows them to do is to determine where people are, where they're traveling, and keep track of this, and then send it to cellular towers as Max's system would do. And they're currently promoting this and using this with fleets for doing a safety score. So it keeps track of how fast people are going at on different roads, and whether they're accelerating or decelerating too much. And it gives them a score of 97 or 80, and this is being used with fleets, and they're charging $20 a month to be able to provide that service. And they also say it can be used for hot lanes to replace min-pass lanes and that sort of thing, so you wouldn't have to put up the gantries or checking points. So I don't know, $240 a year is probably too much to pay for collecting a mileage-based thing, but that includes all the back office and everything, and they just they do the whole system. But if you thought about that being able to do a number of different things, that might be, and that if this were on a broad enough basis, it might come to somewhat less. So you have technologies out there right now that could essentially do the things that a mileage-based user fee would do, but the question is, you're probably not going to be able to do them if that's all that they're going to do. It's going to have to be combined with some other things. So just one last final thing we looked at. We said, is there sort of a transitional approach? One of the problems you have is that you're not going to eliminate the fuel tax overnight. You're not just going to flip a switch and move to a mileage-based user fee system. So at least for a period of time, you're going to have both, and maybe for forever you're going to have both. But we sort of thought through, well, what might be a way in which this could happen? Not necessarily the only way of doing it, but one might be that there would be a base fuel tax component, and rates might even be lowered on the fuel tax, and then there would be a mileage-based charge component, and this would be and the base tax would just be distributed to states, and you meet your basic needs, and then there would be another component that would be mileage-based that could be charged at both the federal and state level, which could be used to fund additional needs, bridge construction, expansion, right-of-way acquisition, some of the other costs that might be debatable as to how much you want to expand the system, but that could be designated for that. And then a local option component that could be added on, where a local community could essentially decide whether they want to spend more in order to enhance their service in their area. So again, there could be a way in which you would be continuing to use the gas tax, but at the same time you would have a mileage-based user fee charge system. So I think I'll stop right there and take any questions. Thank you.
All right, questions for Lee?
Thanks for the presentation. You talked about a couple of questions. One, you talked about the transition. It seems to me the obvious transition point is electric vehicles, and that since fully electric vehicles don't pay any gas tax, and hybrid electric vehicles pay less in gas tax than conventional powered vehicles, that implementing this on a subset of the fleet would be a lot easier than implementing it on all of the fleet. So I don't know if, did you give any thought to that?
Actually, that's the direction that Oregon is going. They've kind of been working on this. They've got a task force. They've been talking to their legislature, and they've come to the conclusion that this is probably the most logical thing to do. One of the issues whenever you start talking about that is that the public says, well, why don't you just charge a higher registration fee? So, I mean, there are if it becomes just strictly an equity issue, which it is. I mean, it's a, I said I'm not going to talk about the task force, but the one conclusion that they came to is they said the equity issue is really the reason for doing this. primarily, and then revenue as a secondary issue, which is sort of a different way, but they're saying, if we're going to make a case for this, you ought to start with that issue. And as far as electric vehicles, even though, one issue is some people say, well, aren't you taking away the incentive for people to use electric vehicles or use more fuel-efficient vehicles? And I would say no, because first of all, the tax itself is a small proportion of what you're paying in gas. And, and right now, most people are doing it because they believe that they want to, help the environment. But they're not, I don't think they're buying it because they're trying to avoid the gas tax. So in fact, in our, that fact that people in electric vehicles are going to suddenly start paying for the roads, there's a lot more costs involved, in that whole thing. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that may very well be the best starting point. Of course, it's costly to start picking out part of the fleet, but it does make sense starting with something where there's a very obvious case for why you ought to do it.
Yeah, and which is small and so easy to implement, and the failure will be moderate. If it's a failure, if there's any kind of technical failures or glitches, it's on a very small set of the people instead of a large set.
Exactly.
Second question I had was, obviously there's some privacy concerns, and there's a set of people in the country who don't believe that the government will be able to keep this tracking information private. It'll get in the courts and so on. And so, but they, on the other hand, trust their credit card companies, their banks, their phone company with all sorts of privacy information, and they're being tracked already. But that's a private firm, and it's not the government, so somehow that's okay. It leads to the idea of disintermediating the government here, and looking at road service providers as sort of a layer where instead of paying the government for the use of the road, you subscribe to some sort of road service provider service, which they charge you based on whatever financing plan they want, and then pay the government based on how much their customers use the roads, which obviously requires some institutional changes, but it might have a number of other types of advantages in terms of management, being able to chase the value chain differently than what we're doing currently. And I don't know, has any thought been given to that? Because if the only reason that it's politically infeasible, or the main reason it's politically infeasible, is the sort of the additional tracking. I mean, there's the additional collection costs as well, but the additional tracking issue, then maybe we should just sort of eliminate the government doing the tracking.
Well, and I think that's a good point. And the reality is that if you set up this kind of a system, you're not going to, you're going to end up contracting out the collection of this anyway. You're not going to set up a new agency, or the IRS is not going to set up a whole bunch of people to start collecting individual payments. So you're going to contract with a firm that would be managing this process. I mean, even with MinPass, I mean, even though that's a small system, MnDOT is contracting for that. So I think but you could use the fact that you're using a private firm as a basis of doing it as a way of sort of creating something of a firewall between the government agency. The one thing that privacy advocates say, however, is that whatever security, as long as the information is being collected in some way, there's always, a government agency can subpoena that information. Now, if it's for a crime, a serious crime, maybe that's not a bad thing. That, I mean, right now, if the fact that we have cameras, in different places, and they can be subpoena information if someone robs a store, that's not a bad thing that happens. The key is that you don't want that tracking to become available to others. But I think you're right in the surveying that we've been doing. When you ask what people think about a private organization doing this versus the government, it does get a more positive response than if you're if the government were actually collecting the data, simply because even if you have various protections against it, I would argue the IRS has it's pretty hard to get information from the IRS, but it can be subpoenaed for certain purposes and can be used, and they can use it, obviously. to to come and impound your car or that sort of thing if you're not paying. But I think there are, this is an issue that has to be dealt with. It's the first thing that people react to whenever you talk about this. They say, oh yeah, here comes the government wanting to track us, and so you've got to deal with that up front in some way. And there are technological ways of keeping all the information within the vehicle itself, and so you're not actually transmitting it, but whether people are going to believe that, and then you might give up some other benefits that it's one of the things that MnDOT's doing on this test is they're testing it as a probe. Well, you want to get a certain amount of probe information. Not none of this is going to be disclosed, but if you can have vehicles traveling around the system where you've got information about that you can put into the system, you can have better information on your on the travel behavior on the system itself without violating anybody's privacy, because you don't care who they are. You just want to know where vehicles are traveling and that sort of thing. So. Good questions of both of them. Is there anybody online? Any questions? No.
All right. Well, with that, I'd ask you to join me in thanking Lee for his presentation today.
Thank you.
And in closing, I just remind you that there is a professional development hour form if you're interested in your packet in front of you, if you're interested in that. The next seminar is next week, Thursday, October 27th, from 3:30 to 4:30, and it will be a presentation from Professor Imran Hai from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at UMD, Duluth campus, and he'll be speaking on the development of a traffic information and dissemination system for work zone environments. And just lastly, if you do want a parking validation, see Joe for a ticket to validate your parking. And I thank you for coming and hope you can join us next week. Thanks.